Hello. Firstly, thank you for joining us this evening for this webinar. We have some excellent guests here to speak about various aspects of the unfolding crisis in the Ukraine. So I suppose we've all watched the unfolding of events in the Ukraine in recent weeks with a mixture of disbelief, horror, and sadness. There's been an outpouring of concern and support across the world and here in Ireland for those who are directly impacted by this, both refugees fleeing the conflict and those who have remained behind and returned home to fight for their country. What we're going to do here is I will introduce our guests. We have four very knowledgeable guests on different aspects of the situation we're facing. And you will be able to put questions in the Q&A box for our guests. And once they've contributed, we can come to the questions and hopefully have a wider discussion. So our four guests tonight are Professor Donnacha Ó Beacháin, who is a geopolitics or is a professor of politics in DCU with a speciality in post-Soviet politics. Anatoliy Prymakov, who is here on behalf of the Association of Ukrainians in Ireland, I suppose to talk to us about both what people are experiencing in the Ukraine at the moment and what the community here in Ireland are doing and engaging with in terms of that. We also have Teresa Buczkowska, who is the integration manager with the Immigrant Council of Ireland, who will be able to talk to us, I suppose, about the welcoming of the refugees who will be coming to Ireland and what we can do both at a political and community level to support them and to ensure they do feel welcome and that they can access all the services they need. And then finally, we have Gary Gannon, TD for the Social Democrats. Gary is the spokesperson on foreign affairs, and he'll be talking to us about, I suppose, the party perspective on this and the political response so far. So what we might do first is go to Donnacha, if he'd like to join us and maybe talk to us a bit about, I suppose, you know, what's led us to this point and the wider geopolitical implications of this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Catherine, and thanks so much for inviting me to meet with everybody here, and also thanks to Gary Gannon, who has been very active in the Oireachtas Committee, of course, of Foreign Affairs and in the Dáil, and of course came to DCU to address students early this year at my request. So a special word of gratitude as well to his tireless activities. It's a very complex story. It's a very long story, and I have spoken about it indeed many times today. And I almost feel guilty sometimes when I start talking about the geopolitics, because at heart this is really a very human story and a human tragedy. And sometimes I feel that we get lost sometimes when we look at the wider geopolitical dimensions. We lose sight of that kind of very human tragedy. And I say that as somebody who has family and friends throughout Ukraine, and some of them have got out, some of them are still there. And it's just unimaginable really what people are experiencing. And it has all happened so quickly. I still myself, I think I'm not alone in this, haven't really digested yet what has happened, the enormity of what has happened, the brutality of what has happened. In terms of the geopolitics, this is in a way a very simple story. It's a story that we've had in Europe before, so we should be familiar with it. It's a naked act of imperialism. It's old-fashioned imperialism. It's the type of territorial conquest of a neighbor that we thought we had departed from in Europe some years ago. And the issue is much bigger than Ukraine. This is something I've been really trying to emphasize over and over again, that this is not Ukraine's war. This is our struggle as well. This is a European struggle for much greater ideals. It's just unfortunate for Ukraine. It's a tragedy for Ukraine that Ukraine is at the front line in this. But they are fighting for us, and we should be fighting for them in every way we can, economically, politically. And I think we also have to acknowledge, and again, I don't want to focus on the negative, but we have to acknowledge that we have let Ukraine down. in the past, and indeed I would say arguably even now, but certainly in the past. Since 2014, Ukraine has been occupied and invaded. And we weren't thinking about Ukraine in 2015 or 16 or 17. Indeed, things like Nord Stream 2 were completed in the last couple of years after the annexation of Crimea and the 14,000 dead as a result of the artificial conflict in Donbass. So we have a lot of questions to ask ourselves, about, and I think this is an opportunity, and again, this is why I'm trying to drift into something positive, to reevaluate where we are and what our priorities are and what our values are, because Ukraine has demonstrated so heroically and so bravely what it means to stand for something, for your neighborhood, for your family, for your friends, for your future. I mean, I think that's why, with these remarkable stories, I know a lecturer in London who a remarkable person, but a very ordinary person in many respects, who was like me, lecturing in her own respective university. She's flown back to Ukraine. Something that I couldn't imagine doing in many respects, but then who knows what you might do when this happens to your country. There's been so many acts of individual bravery and heroism against the odds, and this is such an unwanted war. And so, these are ordinary people doing extraordinary things in extraordinary times. And it's all to resist the will of one man, because I try and avoid using the term Russia and Russians. I don't like to ethnicize the conflict, even though I know that, of course, many Russians will support this, but many Russians don't. I'm in contact with enough of people to know there's a diversity of opinion, but the decision to go to war was certainly one man's. And my fear is that he's a desperate man right now, because I think he was intoxicated by his own rhetoric that Ukrainians were not really a people. They were, begging for liberation from a neo-Nazi government, and therefore would welcome the invading army's liberators. That hasn't happened, as I've said, and now he's frustrated. And I think that one of the things I think is worrying when I see all the refugees fleeing is that there's going to be an assumption that those who are left in the cities are now fighters, that they can get ever more brutal in attacking the cities, and that the war will get worse before it gets better, because of course there's been no signs at all that the Kremlin is looking for anything other than military conquest. Any kind of soundings that have been put out about what kind of exit strategy we might have from this conflict, it is all about simply capitulation. The Ukrainians more or less giving up their country and their right to determine their own future, and indeed to recognize the land grabs that have occurred in the last few weeks and in the last couple of years. And this is why I guess, and maybe I'll conclude in this because I don't want to speak too long. I'm very interested to really listen to what people have to say. But I think we have to rise to the moment here in Ireland. We will have a wave of people coming to us. I'm really heartened by the appetite to do something. I mean, it's so frustrating watching it, from the sidelines, feeling that you can't do something. But I think everybody can do something. As I said, this is my 4th meeting today, and I was even today selling my daughter, who's 8 years old, started making Ukrainian flags at home. I've been selling them to my colleagues. We, believe it or not, that managed to raise €2,000. So you'd be surprised what you can raise, which we're sending to Poland to people we know there who are already volunteering to help refugees. But we can all do something, because we tend to focus a lot. Unfortunately, there's a lot of basis to it on what we can't do. But there are things that we can do. So let me finish on this point. It's not a very geopolitical point, but let us focus on what we can do right now, and do it. And and not just, as I said, for the people of Ukraine, who really deserve all we can give them, but also for ourselves and redeeming our own sense of ourselves, because, as I said, these are for much higher values than just simply a piece of territory. This is for what is good in Europe and what is worth defending in Europe. I'll finish on that.
Thank you very much, Donnacha. And I think you're absolutely right in what you've said. The idea that a sovereign European nation can be under threat in this way is horrific. And this is a threat to all of us, essentially, not just the Ukraine. And we need to recognise that and react in a way that acknowledges that. I'm going to bring in next Anatoliy Prymakov, who is representing the Association of Ukrainians in Ireland. So Anatoliy, I know this is very close to home for you. It's very personal. I'm sure you are grief-stricken by what has happened. If you would be okay to share with us, I suppose, some of your own thoughts on the situation, what the response from the Ukrainian community in Ireland has been like, and what we can do to, I suppose, respond appropriately and compassionately to the unfolding crisis.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. And just before I launch into that, I'd like to say that, Donnacha has made some very valid points in the sense that, Ukraine has been let down for the last 8 years. We had people, Irish people, like, for example, Conor Lenihan, going on RT radio in 2014 and saying, after the annexation of Crimea, of course, Mr. Lenihan working in Moscow at the time, saying that Ukraine was a failed state. However, over the next 8 years, I believe Ukraine has demonstrated over and over again that it isn't a failed state, that given all the challenges of occupation and an ongoing conflict, Ukraine still managed to have, successive, elections, democratically elected leaders, change of government, change of presidents, change of prime ministers, while at the same time Russia has demonstrated none of that. So it's actually the absolute opposite. Ukraine has shown once, over and over again that, the people are willing to move towards the, European values, and Russia has demonstrated absolutely opposite, that it is in a certain way regressing towards a more of a medieval state of mind and state of governance and viewpoint towards the rest of the world. So moving on to the personal, obviously, I don't know if you've heard any of the stories I was sharing recently in the media, but I myself was due to fly out on Sunday, right before right after the conflict has restarted, to get my grandmother to go stay with my cousin. She's at the moment trapped in Donbass in East Ukraine, where the war has been going on for the last 8 years. We've managed to organize her evacuation that is supposed to happen tomorrow. Hopefully everything goes well and she will get to stay with my cousin in central Ukraine. And, hopefully, maybe in the future we will try and work towards bringing her maybe to Poland to stay with some of my family, and maybe in the future to Ireland, because we are talking about an 83-year-old person that moving her an awful lot quickly is not the best idea at this point in time, considering her health situation as well. So that would be my personal, how I've been personally affected. Obviously, not going in even to go into the loss of property values and things like that are happening to myself and other Ukrainian people that everybody is going through, and I know a lot of Ukrainian people within the community in Ireland that are going through the similar situation, in the sense that they have friends and family who have been left behind, whom they have been desperately trying to get out of the country to bring over here, because they may not have other countries to go to. Like, we have to understand that nobody's doing this by choice, right? It is all being done out of necessity. For example, I met a person who said that there's 5 or 6 people staying as guests in my 1-bedroom apartment. I don't know what to do, because it is all being done out of necessity. So that would be kind of the personal struggle of Ukrainian community in Ireland and what they have been trying to do. So what everyone has been trying to do on one hand is bring as many people as they can over here, or help people get out over here, and I suppose everybody's trying to house them to the extent of my knowledge. Everybody's first and foremost trying to house everybody at their own house, at their own home, apartment, and only the people that are, arriving here without any connections that are going to be staying in the hotels at this point in time. The second part of what the Ukrainian community has been doing is obviously the protests, getting vocal, getting out there, organizing events, and being vocal in the community, in the media, in the public, staying in the public's eye, going on the TV, on the radio, doing interviews, raising awareness of what's happening, and asking the government and the society in general to recognize that this war is going on, and that Ukraine needs help at this point in time, because like Donnacha has pointed out recently, this isn't just Ukraine's war. This is a war for the future of Europe. We do not know, some people were saying, okay, let Putin have Crimea. He'll stop now once he has what he needs, because he just needs a naval base. That's not the case. He has the naval base now. He's still not satisfied. So that's what the Ukrainian people have been doing. And the third thing that the Ukrainian people have been doing is sending aid over to Ukraine, any sort of aid, both humanitarian and military. So people in Ukrainian people are very enterprising. You know, there's a lot of parallels between the Irish and the Ukrainian people. So people in the Ukrainian people in Ireland have been clearing out army surplus stores. Anything that can go is going. Sleeping bag, uniforms, munition vests, armor plates that people are somehow able to find and purchase. Now, you know, you wouldn't think that you're able to purchase these items, but they are being found, in a way, hunted down, bought out in bulk, donated by some shops, and everything is being loaded up onto pallets and sent over in Ukraine, because everybody in the Ukrainian community knows somebody who knows somebody in Ukraine who needs, uniforms, munition vests, any sort of items of military significance that can be sent over, and it has all been, rounded up and sent over. For example, on the way home, I was asked to stop by a company, and they've handed out to me 2 charging points and 11 Motorola walkie-talkies that will be used, that will be shipped out to Ukraine and will be used on the front lines, will be used by military personnel. Maybe not necessarily military personnel, maybe the first responders, like, frontline workers, like, like the police, ambulance drivers, electricians repairing down power lines, all that kind of stuff. So, so we can sum up that what the Ukrainian community has been doing is, taking in refugees that they can't take in, staying in the public eye, making sure that the people of Ireland, the society in Ireland, is aware of what's happening, and that it isn't just Ukraine's struggle, it is Europe's struggle, and trying to help Ukraine to fight the war by any means that they can. Everything's going east: money, supplies, food, equipment, helmets, munition vests, rucksacks, sleeping bags, anything that can be used in the conflict. And what can Ireland do to help Ukraine? Well, first of all, Ukrainian community and Ukraine needs to know that they're not alone in the struggle, because, like Donnacha has pointed out, in a way, Ukraine has been left around for a while. All those things that he mentioned, like Nord Stream 2, the continuation of doing business with Russia and Putin, that all has been happening for 8 years. So Ukraine now needs to feel that, enough is enough. This time it's for real. This time we will support you, because we understand that it's you now, us next. That's the message that Ireland needs to be putting forward, and that's where Ireland needs to be coming from. And there needs to be a recognition of the situation. This isn't just, some sort of conflict. The way the Ukrainian community in Ireland and the way people in Ireland view this war is that this is a genocidal war of survival, a medieval conquest, the denial of nationhood, denial of statehood, a denial of right to exist. For example, Putin saying that I'm not real. My nationality history is not real. But, I beg to differ. For example, this is the second time that I'm potentially, my people will experience genocide. My family went through genocide in 1932, 1933. On our property in a village in East Ukraine, we have unmarked makeshift graves of my great-grandmother's father and her sister that are still there, still buried. So, if anybody says to me I'm being too harsh, I'm being hysterical, I would like to bring those people to stand at those graves, look me in the eye and say, you're wrong. Do you know what I mean? So that's the viewpoint of what is happening from the Ukrainian community. And that is why there needs to be a lot of support, and Ukraine needs to know that they're not on their own. And, but that support, while, the messaging is very important, that, that Ukrainians don't feel like they're on their own, it is important to, put that into action as well. So for Russia, right? But, how do you raise the cost? First of all, doing business, that has to stop with Russia. It will hurt us, but, if Europe would have done this years ago, wouldn't be hurting us as much now. So doing business with Russia needs to stop. Ties need to stop. And, lastly, a lot of people are asking me, how can we stop Putin? And, unfortunately, I don't have any other answer than flood Ukraine with weapons and money. You have to flood Ukraine with weapons and money. Marshall Plan for Ukraine. If we've done it before, we can do it again. Airdrop supplies in. Do whatever you need to do, but make sure that Ukraine doesn't fall. Do you want extra few million of refugees in EU? If you don't, do that, because the cost of restoring the infrastructure, the country, restoring the disruption to the supply of food and the materials that Ukraine has been producing will be enormous, and it will increase exponentially the longer this conflict goes on. So flood Ukraine with weapons and money at any sort of level that you can, and that's the only way you can help Ukraine survive, and that's the only way you can stop Putin, and that's the best way to help.
Thank you, Anatoliy. I mean, your words are very moving. I suppose this is absolutely a brutal imperialist war, and it has to be named as such. And I noticed you say, it's kind of, it's you now, us next. It's more than that. I think it's about doing what's right, not just about perceived threat to oneself. And we recognise, I suppose, here in Ireland what it's like to have nationhood denied and undermined, and would be very passionate about the right to self-determination and sovereignty for Ukraine. I'm going to bring in next Teresa Buczkowska, who is the integration manager with the Immigration Council of Ireland. And I suppose we've all been watching reports in terms of refugees who will be arriving in the country, and there's been an outpouring in terms of people offering homes and support. And I'm sure, like many of you, I've seen in my local community people stepping forward in whatever way they can to offer support. I suppose, Teresa, I'm interested to hear, I suppose, what you think we need to be doing both at a political and a community level to facilitate the best welcome we can provide. And I know from talking to you beforehand that this is quite personal to you as well, and that you come from a part of Poland that borders the Ukraine. So it's obviously impacting you personally too, and I'm conscious of that.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you about how we can support refugees beyond humanitarian aid. Yes, it is personal for me, but not only because I am from the bordering region, but any human rights violation is a personal issue to me. But before I start talking about the support for arriving refugees, I wouldn't do it justice if I didn't commend it, the amazing acts of solidarity that we've seen from members of communities, both in Poland and Ireland. And it only shows that communities are always first to move when it comes to solidarity before the state does any movement. So those acts of solidarity are just the most beautiful acts that we can see when it comes to humanity. But people will be arriving only with maybe one suitcase, so they will be in need of that humanitarian aid in Ireland as well. And also, I would call everyone now who thinks about donating items like shampoos, cleaning products, clothes to Ukraine. Really think about that, because I am observing reports from charity organizations working on the border. They are overwhelmed with the items. They have no place to store them. Some of those donated items are being left out in open air, and it's winter in Poland and Ukraine. It's cold, it's rainy, there is lots of snow. Those donated items will go to waste. And also, what you're paying for those items here in Ireland, they will go much longer way in Poland or Romania or Slovakia. And also the cost of transport is eating a lot of money. So instead of donating items, please consider donating cash to those organizations. But also please consider supporting integrational needs of refugees here in Ireland. As I've mentioned, welcoming refugee policies are an issue of political will, and so is integration. So the first need for refugees here is access to information. We organized our webinar for Ukrainians on Monday. Over 360 people from across Europe joined. And it was clearly that there is a huge need for information. People don't have access to information. They are sourcing information from unsecure places. There is lots of confusion, miscommunication. So we need to support organizations who are providing quality, trusted information to people, especially that there will be some legal issues that people will be facing. Maybe not an arrival, because we know people don't need visa, but when people are arriving to Ireland, have only 90 days to regularize their status. After that 90 days, they might become undocumented if they don't regularize their status. And every case will be different, because if you are arriving in Ireland to join your family members, you will have a different options for regularization of your status. But if you are arriving not joining anyone here, your options will be completely different. And then also on top of that, we will have families who are mixed families. So you might have a Ukrainian resident, Ukrainian citizens arriving with family members who are not Ukrainian, and those options will be completely different. And people will need access to legal support to understand what are their rights and to understand how to regularize that status to avoid situation when they might be undocumented. Another issue is that the government has immediately fixed capacity of the GNIB, which is the Garda National Immigration Bureau. There is a statutory requirement that will also involve Ukrainians, that you have to register with GNIB within 90 days of your arrival. But the waiting time right now is 120 days. So that is completely unsustainable. Then we also know that those queues will be even more, because that's already unsustainable before we even are receiving larger numbers of refugees. So imagine what will happen there. So government has to fix the capacity of GNIB to process all those issues. And then we need resources to organizations like the Immigrant Council of Ireland, Irish Refugee Council, who are providing legal support to people, free, confidential legal support, because that will be the first issue that we need to tackle. Another issue will be once people are registered, once people are coming here in Ireland, they will have exactly the same integration needs as migrants already in Ireland. In terms of access to education, access to health, access to accommodation. And one of those issues and barriers that also needs immediate attention of the government, for example, is recognition of qualification. The current system that is in place is completely unfit for purpose. It's a timely and lengthy and costly process that gives no security for people. So the certificate that the government issues to people who are getting their qualification recognized has no legal value for them, because currently no employer or third-level education institution has any obligation to accept that certificate. So people will be coming and those qualifications might be not recognized in Ireland. That needs to be fixed. And then lastly, an issue with housing. And here, obviously, we all experiencing a housing crisis. So far, we had those refugees who are arriving now, they usually are staying with family and friends. So they are arriving with pre-arranged situations for housing. But I'm working with a migrant rights group in Cllr, which is Eastern European migrant rights group, together RASM. They are working on the ground. And they already today had a case of 2 women arriving at their doorstep, presenting themselves as homeless because the accommodation that they had on arrival is not available for them anymore. So that will be an issue. People are offering rooms, they are offering spare bedrooms, but they think that this is only temporary, maybe for 4 weeks, maybe for 8 weeks. It's not going to finish in 4 or 8 weeks. So we need a sustainable plan for housing for refugees. When it comes to housing as well, there is lots of goodwill. As I've mentioned, we have to commend the Irish society for pledging so much support. But where there is a lot of goodwill and there is a crisis situation, there will be also predators. And the issue of trafficking of women and children will be an issue. We haven't had any case in Ireland yet, but this is an issue in Poland, in Germany, especially where women and children being trafficked for sexual exploitation. There might be an issue of landlords offering accommodation in exchange for sexual favors. And we know that this is a real danger because just 2 weeks ago, we had a report in the media that this is the situation that other migrant women are being now subjected to. So we need protections against that, and we need to support housing support for people so they can avoid a similar exploitative situation, but also support for organizations who are offering help for people who were subjected to those exploitative situations. And lastly, if you are considering supporting migrant and refugees from Ukraine, you might consider community sponsorship, which is a form of resettlement where members of neighborhood are pulling together resources and they are offering integration support, including housing to one person or a family. So if you are interested in that, get in touch with NASC in Cork or Dora Slumni in Limerick, because they are specializing in supporting communities interested in community resettlement. And then lastly, support and donate money to migrant-led organizations like Together Razem in Cork. They are a grassroots organization. They are Polish. There are lots of cultural and historical similarities between Ukrainians and Polish people. So that's why there is instant level of trust. So that's why those organizations are getting a lot of demand for their services, and they are overwhelmed. So they need support, because Together Razem is a small organization. They have 3 staff who are part-time, and they have dozens and dozens of refugees already arriving at their door. And then lastly, support other organizations who are providing essential services. As I said, access to information, access to legal support will be key in the next couple of weeks. Remember, the people have only 90 days to regularize their status. So those services need to be resourced as well. So I might stop here. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. That was hugely comprehensive. There's an awful lot to take in and consider there. If you feel able to, you might put some links in the chat for those kind of reputable organizations you're talking about donating to, who already have kind of trust. Just because I'm conscious that in crisis situations, people can start putting up kind of random organizations and whatever it might be that, again, are predatory. So organizations we can trust to donate to are very important. I absolutely concur with what you began with, which is that you know, our compassion and our empathy has to extend to all refugees fleeing conflict and climate crisis situations, not just in this situation. So you know, that is something we very much need to consider. And just on, I found what you said about the, you know, people offering accommodation, but how you will always have a small number of people who are potentially predatory, quite interesting. I know that over 50 children have gone missing in state care, migrant children, in the last 5 years or so. So we will need, you know, proper checks from government and proper monitoring of what's happening to ensure that people who are arriving are being kept safe and not under any threat of any kind. Thank you very much for the links you're putting in the chat there, Teresa. Very much appreciated. I'll go next, if I can, to Gary Gannon, who is the Social Democrats spokesperson on foreign affairs. And Gary, you might talk to us about what you think about some of the response to this situation so far.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you especially to Anatoliy, Teresa and Donnacha. And let's begin by where we should, by expressing our huge solidarity, sympathy with the people of Ukraine and with the horrific injustice that's been inflicted on them at the moment by the forces of Vladimir Putin. I suppose, look, oftentimes when we come on these left-bank conferences, we talk about a Social Democrats position that's well developed in relation to housing, education, public services. This situation is very different. It's fast moving, and we want to be responding in as empathetic and compassionate and, I suppose, as deliberate means as possible. When I think about the position of Social Democrats, that's actually the position of the Irish people. And we have this old concept in Ireland. I was just writing down, listening to Teresa speak, and the idea of the metal response. And it's an old Irish terminology that in a time of crisis, that neighbours come together and give whatever we can and whatever means we can as a means of supporting each other. And that should and will be the response of the Irish people. You've seen us opening up our homes, you've seen us providing supports, and the legitimate organisations that Teresa sent through to us there, we'll be ensuring to share them through our various different platforms that we can. I suppose that for me will be the response. We will give as much as we possibly can in a means of demonstrating solidarity with an injustice that's incomprehensible to those of us who thought we'd never see this degree of savagery again in the world. there's a variety of means by which we can do that. We're expecting, or there's talk of up to and more than 100,000 people seeking refuge in Ireland at the minute. They're going to need the very things that already have been talked about over the course of years in Ireland. They're going to place huge degree of want on our public services, and we have to be able to meet that. So in terms of what our immediate Dáil calls will be, and I'll be making this I'll be making this in the Dáil tomorrow, actually, during leaders' questions. We want to be able to ensure that we have a considered plan that's ready to go. If not now, well then very, very soon. I'm very conscious that 100,000 predominantly women and children coming to Ireland, they're going to need a variety of wraparound services. I'll start off with education because that's something that's really important to me. We were the first party to write to Minister Norma Foley last week as the crisis unfolded, basically talking about the type of trauma supports that we're going to need in our education systems, increase in English language teachers, increase in all of those sort of services that you would have needed in schools. We already have one of the highest proportion of student to teacher ratios in the country. So that's going to require a huge degree of surge on our education system that has to be met. So again, we need to get our student teachers back in. We need our mental health supports in our schools to ensure that when students arrive, they can do so into a place that's compassionate, that's trauma informed, where they have the capacity to catch up in terms of language supports. That'll be the first thing that we're doing. There was a report released a couple of weeks ago from the St. Vincent de Paul that talked about the cost of survival in this country for people who are already on the breadline. I imagine that report was designed in January before we're going to have an increase of another 100,000 people, which is going to create even further need. We have to be able to meet that. So the very calls that were made in that report was St. Vincent de Paul for increased fuel allowance, increased social welfare payments made directly to people who are at the forefront. We're going to have people who, I listened to a minister yesterday in the Dáil talking about the fact that many people arriving into the country from Ukraine seeking refuge will be able to work immediately, and that's absolutely a great thing. That should have been afforded to all people seeking refuge. But I'm also very conscious that that doesn't take into account the fact that people will be arriving here seeking experiencing huge levels of trauma. And we shouldn't be expecting somebody arriving here to seeking trauma to go straight into the workplace, wherever that may be. So I think we need to fight back against that completely. The people coming here, they need direct social protection payments. They need to not experience the same level of poverty. They need to not be just asked to experience poverty that's already been experienced in this country. So nobody should be forced to just go straight into the workplace. So that's not something that should happen. If somebody chooses that, so be it. But it shouldn't be an expectation that we have on people. So we'll be fighting against that completely. Housing supports. Housing needs to be happening in a manner that's dignified. I mean, there's talk of modular housing, and modular housing can be great if it's done to an effective standard. So be it. We need to ensure that nobody is left on the streets. People that are opening their homes up to refugees, and Irish people are brilliant in that. But as Teresa said, this is not going to be something that lasts for 2, 4, and 6 weeks. So there will come a point where things start to strain a little bit. Politics has to be a place where we demonstrate leadership of that and cut back against anybody who's pointing at other people who come in here seeking refuge from Ukraine or elsewhere and trying to cast blame on them. The political people in politics have to be the forefront of standing up and saying absolutely no. And we don't equivocate in the place as this has to be a place of welcome, has to be a place of sanctuary. Sanctuary requires the state to step in and provide all of those sorts of supports, being trauma-informed and public services supports, including social welfare payments, childcare, access to education, access to the workplace when people are ready, and not forcing anybody in there at a time when they're not. And that'll be hugely important. Moving on to other areas, in my capacity as the spokesperson on foreign affairs, look, I've been very vocal right from the beginning in relation to the sanctions. We absolutely have to crush the economy of Vladimir Putin and those who he surrounds himself by. So yes, there will be hardship within that for anyone experiencing it. They're designed to crush the Russian economy, not our own, but inevitably there's going to be pushback on that. But we have to stay strong in that regard. There's a variety of different things we can do. Lukashenko in Belarus, who's providing huge amounts of support, both military and otherwise, to Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's surrounded by fertilizer barracks. There is going to be a cost of food crisis in this country, but we need to go at that because we need to crush them on that. There should be no crescendo effect to the sanctions either. It shouldn't be a case that the more savage Putin gets, we increase the sanctions exponentially. We actually have to hit them hard, hit them fast, and hit them now. And that is going to require being innovative and being brave as well. One of the meetings we had today with the Social Democrats was talking about how we can completely remove ourselves from fossil fuel dependency in the short and medium term, both kind of at a national response, but also as a European collective. So investing in our wind farm capacities, seeking alternative sources. So no longer do we enable these tyrants of Putin and the oligarchs that they surround themselves by, and being brave, being fast and being swift in that regard. We were the first political party to call for the expulsion of the Russian ambassador, and we done it on the very first day of the invasion. I don't equivocate on that one degree. There has been suggestions, there has been blowback to say that we do that, we cut off diplomatic channels. Let me tell you, a couple of weeks ago before the invasion, about 2 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, we had the Russian ambassador into the Foreign Affairs Committee. He told us that it would be insanity for Russia to invade Ukraine. So he completely told us it wasn't going to happen. If this person is here as a mouthpiece of Putin, if he's here to lie, if he's here to evade, if he's here to spread mistruths, well, then he doesn't get to be here. We can have other means for which we can keep open some degree of dialogue, with, be that with a diplomat's second or so be it. But I think the Irish people need to send strong, swift messages here that actually, if the Russian embassy is being used for nefarious purposes, be that for purposes of espionage, purposes of spreading mistruths, but then they don't get to be here in this democracy. So we call for the expulsion, and I think it would send a strong message from the Irish people that we're not going to put up with their bluster, that we will cut off the relations with them, that we will treat them as pariahs of old, if so be it. They're the responses that we made initially. I'm here to listen. We're here to kind of get more feedback from yourselves in here in terms of how we can be stronger and be part of a stronger kind of European response across the board. So that's our initial thoughts. But Katrin, I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up.
Thank you very much, Gary. We might go, I know there's a question here in the Q&A.
Katrin, one other thing I forgot to mention, actually being self-reflective in terms of our response too. We also stood in the Dáil a couple of weeks ago and mentioned the fact that 118 billion of European money was being funneled through the IFSC, and we've asked for a seizure of those assets and to close down the corporations, the Russian corporations and shell corporations that are benefiting from our kind of legislative anomalies and using it to funnel money to Putin's allies. So asking for those assets to be seized initially as well, I think it's an important call to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. Follow the money. Most definitely important in terms of shutting down Putin's own interests. I'm curious, Gary, I'm going to throw in one question here to you before I go to the questions. I've been approached by people with suggestions of various locations as potential reception centres to be put into action in the immediate weeks, such as the Ioneer Hospital on Bagot Street. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of reception centres, if they were truly reception centres and welcoming and providing the services we need, it's not a bad one. But I'm conscious that these things in Ireland temporary solutions can become permanent problems.
I'm very conscious of that too, Katrin. And also who runs these places and what purpose they run these places for too. I don't want, in Ireland, we've always been very good at monetising other people's hardship. And I don't want these centres to become that. So if they are going to operate, they need to be state-run. They need to have all of the wraparound services that would be needed. I mean, there's any number of suggestions. A couple of people mentioned barracks to me also that could be actually repurposed. Fine suggestions, but actually they need to be considered. We need to understand we can't just put people into one place without providing services. So I think they can happen, but I'm very conscious it needs to happen. And certainly not slowly, but we can't be too quick to just put, people seeking refuge here, placing them all together and not giving them the appropriate degree of responses, and also not enabling other corporations to benefit from their hardship either, which we've seen in terms of other refugees and migrants coming here and specifically into the direct provision centres. So as long as those places are state-run, as long as they're done with empathy, compassion, and have all of the services a person that would need seeking refuge here, I'll be fine with it. But it'll probably take a couple of, something that's not going to happen overnight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary. I might go to a question we have here that I know Donnacha would like to answer. I'll read this out. Donnacha, thank you very much for your clarity of vision and your support. As you know, Ukraine desperately needs air defense systems and planes to be able to counter horrific Russian airstrikes into the Ukrainian cities. NATO and particularly Germany have been slow to react. Can you comment about this and what Ukraine and we can do to make this happen? So Donnacha, we might go to you on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a consistent request of the Ukrainian government to you know to close the skies, essentially. To, I mean, Ukrainians, they not only need solidarity, they need protection, and they need the ability, of course, to protect themselves. And a no-fly zone has been an integral part of what the Ukrainian government's looking at. And of course, it's difficult looking at it from the vantage point of Ireland, because of course any no-fly zone would be introduced by NATO, and of course Ireland's not a member of NATO. But you know, just to comment briefly on some of the arguments that have been used against a no-fly zone, I've noticed that it largely hinges on the fact that Vladimir Putin has nuclear weapons, and you don't want NATO to come into conflict with the power that has nuclear weapons. I just would say to that Vladimir Putin will always have nuclear weapons, and if 44 million people are not worth defending, and as I said, it's not an aggressive act to say that you can't have military aircraft flying over and bombing people. I mean, that's not a matter of escalating a conflict. That's a matter of de-escalating. Escalating a conflict is allowing aerial bombardments of civilians and doing nothing. To me, that's the unacceptable escalation. But if 44 million people, you know, I mean, 1.4 million people are living in Estonia, and they are being protected. So I think 44 million people, 30 times the size of Estonia, they are also worth protecting. And I think there is a tendency to look at it purely from the fact that, you know, Russia will be, you know, Russia will view this as a hostile act, and that Russia has, as I said, large military resources, but NATO also has superior resources compared to Russia. I mean, I take just on Gary's point about the Russian economy and how it has to be subjected to pressure. I mean, it's important not to be overawed sometimes by Russia. I mean, it is the largest country in the world, but its economy in terms of GNP size is equivalent to that of Italy. That's the kind of size of the economy we're talking about. It may be the biggest country in the world, but its population is substantially less than Nigeria. So this is not a global superpower. This is a regional bully who gets its power only for the fact that it has a big stick and it's willing to use it. But that's where I think, you know, the Ukrainians are legitimately, I think, looking for more than just solidarity. They're looking at least for the means to help themselves. And as I said, the no-fly zone, as I said, I know it arouses controversy. I'm only expressing my own opinion on this, but I see it more, the nearest thing we've seen to this is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and you'll have to forgive me for using the long view in this. It's just an occupational hazard. And you might remember that John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, which, by the way, the Cuban government didn't want. And he euphemistically called it a quarantine. That was essentially a no-ship zone. It wasn't a no-fly zone, it was for ships. And people argued at the time that that would lead to escalation, it would lead to nuclear war. What would happen when the Soviet ships approached Cuba? Surely they'd have to be turned back, or there might be altercations between them. But it worked. And I think that, you know, deterrence is still a key thing when it comes to Vladimir Putin, because he tends to pick, as any bully would, on those countries that he thinks are weaker. And I think that that's why it's up to Ukraine's partners to demonstrate that Ukraine is not alone, that Ukraine has support. And I think the question made reference to Germany. I mean, Germany has a particular history, of course. It is, you know, worried about militarism, and that's a very, of course, good thing. It tries not to engage in conflict, which is also a good thing. But there are other lessons from Germany's history that we have to take, and that is that appeasing an aggressor doesn't necessarily mollify the aggressor. Sometimes it just emboldens them, and that goes back to the point I think that Anatoly was making earlier, that, you know, Putin was emboldened by the weak sanctions that were imposed in 2014 and the weak reaction. That's what we should have learned, that Vladimir Putin doesn't respond to weakness, he only responds to strength. So there's a lot of points there. I know. I just, while I have the microphone, because I just want to briefly throw out the thing that about the refugees. Just very extremely briefly, I'd love to know as well what Teresa, since I'm not going to be asking questions in the questions and answer session, but Poland already has had the huge amount of refugees, and I saw the remarkable statistic that when it had reached about 600,000 refugees, that there wasn't one single camp, that everybody had found a home. So they seem to have already adopted a practice, which I'm wondering, is there anything we can learn from what they are already doing? Because they're all, you know, what they are experiencing, it seems we will be experiencing in some form soon. And similarly with Moldova, I lived in Moldova for 2 years, and it's just remarkable that this is a country half the size of Ireland. It's the poorest country on paper in Europe, and they have taken in 250,000 refugees. And I'm just wondering, what are they doing, and is there kind of a best practice emerging from how they're dealing with I was just amazed, by the way, with the overview that you gave, Teresa. By the way, I just learned so much, and I'm kind of it gave me a lot of food for thought that I'll follow up later. But I just was wondering, is there anything we can learn from what's going on already in Poland and Moldova?
What's happening in Poland is very organic, and it's very uncoordinated. And as much as this should be commended because this is people's goodwill, at the same time there is a danger in that as well, because if it's uncoordinated, nobody knows who's housing whom, and everything is because people are passing information. I have an empty room, I can pledge a bedroom and stuff like that. So there is a danger, unfortunately, but it's been partially because we have common enemy. We know in Poland that we can be next, and we will be next. Like in Poland, my cousin was called back from reserve army back to the army because there is genuine need for people to feel safe. So people are kind of, so the government is kind of doing something by calling back reserve members of the army. But I think there is a particular historical and cultural context why that happened with Ukrainians, and for example, why that didn't happen with Syrian and Afghanis at the Belarusian border. So that we have to also ask ourselves question about that. And also, that support in Poland, because it's unorganized and because people don't really realize how long they're gonna be in it. There might be questions and challenges in the long run, because people will be like, okay, we've been housing for 12 weeks. I want my life back. I want my bedroom back, because people are really committing, not even spare bedrooms. They kind of squeeze themselves into one room and they offer another room to the refugees because there is that high level of solidarity. But that will eventually tire people out. So we need to put a long-term plan, and we need to learn from that, that a long-term plan, a coordinated plan is needed.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I just listening to you, and obviously it's a very separate issue, but we saw during the worst of the COVID pandemic that governments can enact a crisis response that really does, change how they respond to things, and the speed and the efficiency with which they respond to things when the will is there. So I hope we see the same urgency in the response to provision of supports and accommodation and all of that in this situation that we've seen previously. I have a question here that's come in for Anatoliy, if that's okay. Just asking, could you talk to us a little bit about the sort of this myth that this propaganda that Putin is putting out there, that Eastern Ukrainians are waiting for the Russians as liberators? I know this is the part of Ukraine you come from yourself, and I'm wondering, I suppose, what your personal response to that is.
My personal response to that is that since 2014, the best performing, some of the best performing military units in that war were from those areas, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, who have been motivated, who have turned around and said, no, this is Ukrainian land, and you can't do that. So that response has already been provided. I'm only repeating and highlighting what has happened over the last 8 years. Some of the best performing soldiers, units, and people, and some of the most heroic acts, they were done by Russian-speaking people from that area, who have been doing that for the last 8 years. That's all people really need to know about the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Donbass welcoming Russian soldiers as liberators.
From what I understand, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Zelensky himself is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian.
Yeah,
Russian
exactly.
is his first language, and he has been trying through Russian to appeal to the ordinary people of Russia to oppose this. And in fairness, I would like to acknowledge the people who have come out in Russia on the streets in protest against this at great personal risk. I think that's commendable as well. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
Well, the overwhelming view of the Ukrainian community on the protests in Russia is, while commendable, is that that's not enough. And the comparison that always draws is Look at what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Look at how many, how long the protests have gone on, the severity of those protests, and how many people have died in order to achieve what Ukraine has achieved in 2014. And, people within the Ukrainian community, like my personal view, but the people overwhelming view within the Ukrainian community is that when we see something like that, then let's talk. On a personal level, obviously, it is commendable to see any sort of anti-war movements. There's a lot of people, like you see, for example, elderly Russian women who have survived the blockade of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, coming out against the war, and that's very commendable. It's heartbreaking to see because, those people realize what's happening and they are against that, and those people are being arrested. But, the community view is that, Russians can and should do more,
Thank you, Anatoliy. I have a question here from Garrett, who I know has family connections in Ukraine, saying Russia seems to be losing a lot of equipment, planes, helicopters. I'm not sure how much the Ukraine is losing militarily aside from physical infrastructure. Is there a chance that the Ukraine's armed forces can counterattack successfully, given that there are stories of unmotivated Russian soldiers? So I think maybe, Anatoliy, if you want to speak to that, and then Donnacha, would that work?
Yeah. So just to start, something I've read recently was, a person highlighting that so far Ukrainian side has been absolutely crushing the information space in the war sense. So the only casualties that they've been showing is civcas, or civilian casualties, while highlighting any and all successes of the Ukrainian military versus the Russian military, right? At the same time, you have to also, you have to consider the fact that, while Russian military, while massive, you have to consider the facts that, the motivation is a big factor, because, your conscripts that have been conscripted and sent to serve in Russian military forces, there's only, they take a certain period of time that they are, in training, and they're effective for, for battle, kind of, active service, active duty for a short period of time, and then they want to get out and get on with their lives. They're not professional soldiers. They're not taking it as their profession. So they're, that is true that the motivation is lacking in a lot of Russian military units, and that has been visible in the north of Ukraine, in the military action in the north of Ukraine, more so than in the south of Ukraine. I think the factor there may be the fact that that the more contract professional soldiers have been coming through the south of Ukraine from Crimea, who would have been posted there previously, whereas in the north Ukraine, you would have had conscripts sitting in the field for a month, right? In terms of Ukrainian military launching a counteroffensive, it's early days yet. It takes a significant amount of time, and it is very challenging logistically to mobilize any sort of significant force. And Russia has been doing that for a few months before they launched this attack. We've seen the warning signs that Russia is doing that from early December, and it has taken, around, 2 months, 2.5, 3 months to build up a significant enough force. So maybe, so Ukraine, while they've announced a general mobilization and conscription, it will require a certain period of time until the military is able to build up a certain amount of forces that they're able to maneuver around and, launch counteroffensives with. At the same time, also, you have to consider the fact that, the resources issue, that, if this does become a war of attrition, logistics and being able to produce, ammunition, weaponry, and all of those items will play a big factor. And Ukraine will also need to come up with a way to produce all of that, because, certain population areas, like, for example, Kharkiv, are on the fire, and they would have been, say, for example, producing tanks. Certain production facilities are no longer available. And that is another challenge that they would need to overcome before turning towards, thinking about counteroffensive and the like.
Thank you. Just that same question, Donnacha, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of it? Do you think a kind of a counter-offence or a rallying from Ukrainian forces, who obviously are more motivated in terms of protecting their country rather than being conscripted or, dragged into conflict in that way? Is there anything you'd like to add in terms of it? You're just on mute there, if that's...
Just to say that you know, obviously it depends on the weaponry that will be consistently available to Ukrainians. I mean, we saw there in the last 24 hours that there was this attempt to provide MiG-29s from Poland, and that has now not gone ahead. That would have been quite a huge assistance in defending, because of course those aircraft, while old, they're old Soviet models, they would have been known to Ukrainian pilots and would have been quite effective in defending the skies. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, we don't know yet, we don't even have accurate statistics on how many soldiers have died, and probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle of the different claims. But I mean, the Ukrainian armed forces have said they have killed over 12,000 Russian soldiers. Now, if that's anywhere remotely close to accurate, even if it's, you know, overestimating by 50%, you have to put that in perspective that the Soviet army that the Kremlin sent to Afghanistan, it lost 14,000 troops in 10 years of fighting, and ultimately lost. And of course, it was one of the many factors that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. To lose several thousand troops in Ukraine in just 13 days. And as I said, this is still at a stage which is escalatory, and unfortunately so, is just remarkable. And I think it underlines again that Vladimir Putin has wagered everything on this war, that his regime, its survival depends on it, and that will make him ever more desperate. I think if it does, there's a chance that in some parts, at least of Ukraine, it may evolve into a more irregular form of warfare. That's certainly a possibility. I know that Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, has distributed, I think, 25,000 semi-automatic weapons to citizens there and 10 million rounds of ammunition. That would be a very different type of war, of course. And I think if you look again in the comparative context, which is something that I do, the military conquest, if it happens, and it's not guaranteed in this context at all, but it tends to be comparatively swift. It's the occupation that drains the resources of the occupying regime. And you only have to look at, like, you know, Iraq and Afghanistan and similar things to see the truth of that, because then you end up with what's known as the war of the flea. The dog is the occupying regime in this regard, and it has far too much territory to cover. It has an agile and invisible enemy, and certainly the idea of occupying 44 million Ukrainians is just something that's not long-term sustainable. So I think the point I've emphasized, because I'm not a military strategist or an expert or anything like that, but I think the point I've always tried to take away.
You're breaking up there, Duncan, or at least I'm not hearing you.
You know, Ukraine has been lost forever, as far as, you know, the Kremlin is concerned, because the more important battle isn't for territory, it's for hearts and minds, and they have been completely lost and will be forever lost.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, listening to you speak, let's hope it doesn't get to the point of occupation, because that would be an absolute tragedy and catastrophe for the people of Ukraine. Teresa, I have a question for you. I have two, in fact, and I might roll them together. One is more personal. So we have somebody in the Q&A saying, my family are refugees from communist Romania and my girlfriend is from Russia. We ended up in Ireland and now live in Dublin. In addition to providing accommodation and donating cash, what can we do to help? So that's obviously quite a personal question from somebody who feels huge solidarity. And the other question then is more, do you feel that the government is in control of and prepared for the arrival of these refugees?
I'm gonna address first question first. Let's remember that human rights, equality, welcoming policies are never given. This is something that we fight very hard for, and we can lose very easily. And as much as Ireland doesn't have right-wing political parties, we are not immune, and that's a realistic danger. So my advice here would be vote for people who represent your values and who will be protecting those equality, human rights, and welcoming refugee policies. Because if we get different government, those welcoming policies might not exist anymore. Is Irish government ready? No, because our immigration system is broken, and we are bringing now 100,000 people into a broken immigration system. We've been advocating for reform of the immigration system, and that's a key. Simple example. Every person coming to Ireland from Ukraine will have statutory requirement to register with immigration systems but we don't have working system that is offering people appointments, because even people now living in Ireland are struggling with getting appointments on time. That's one example, and then on top of that there is many more. So that there will be a problem. And also one thing is that the government is organizing meetings with civil societies. That information has to trickle down to communities. Organizations like Together Razem in Cork, who's working on the grassroots, they are uninformed, nobody contacted them, they are working with refugees right now. Information has to flow to them because they don't know what's happening, and they have to be invited to the decision-making table because they know exactly what are the integrational needs of refugees in Ireland. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I mean, obviously on a very limited level compared to you, but I have experience of people trying to get appointments with GNIB and logging on every day and trying to get appointments and not being able to over the course of months. So, I mean, I can't imagine. They'll have to work very hard, very quickly on making that work. Gary, that same kind of question, and we might wrap up then because we're coming up on the hour and 15 minutes. From a slightly different perspective, I suppose, like you are in the conversations that are happening in committees and in the Dáil and wherever it might be on this. Do you have a sense that the government are prepared or are preparing for the arrival of refugees? Do you have any optimism to share with us on that?
Look, I think we have to have optimism. Where else do we? I don't think anyone in the opposition are in these conversations, but we are advocating and lobbying, and we're calling up ministers, and we're being told that conversations are ongoing. I was on the radio on Saturday with Damien English, and I mean, he kept saying you can't expect to have this ready to go on day one, which I suppose will give a little bit of leeway to point that's fair enough. But I mean, the point I made to him, there does come day 3, day 4, day 5, and we have an expectation of more clarity to be given, and people's needs are met as soon as applicably possible. So look, I think we're in uncharted territory for many of us here at the moment in terms of kind of a 21st century response to a crisis of this nature. I believe fully that people across the political divide in Ireland of the more sensible parties absolutely want to meet this need. So we're going to work collaboratively with people. We're going to make suggestions. Tomorrow we'll be raising issues in the Dáil or in relation to therapy and counselling supports. And I believe we'll be met with a welcoming air. I absolutely believe that everybody wants to meet this crisis. So to us, there's an onus on us all to work together. I don't think we can engage in too much waffle or have too much time for waffle. There needs to be a concerted effort across the political spectrum from government downwards to make it very clear to people, here's what happens when you arrive. I talked to one person today in one of the support services who got a phone call from a woman who was 31 weeks pregnant, who was simply asking, where does she go? And that's the sort of information that wasn't even there. So look, we're in the early days of this. We can make justifications and allowances the fact that we're learning as we go, but that won't last too long. We need a wholehearted response. People need clarity. There's a humanitarian crisis. We need to be able to meet it. That doesn't start with me casting aspersions across people in government or elsewhere. It actually just starts with going, look, let's work collaboratively on this. Here are the level of need, and we have to believe that we can work together to meet it.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks. As I say, we might wrap up now because we're at that kind of hour and 15 minutes, and I'm conscious that you've all given up your time to be here, and very grateful for that, particularly in the difficult circumstances that some of you are facing.
If I can have a final remark.
Absolutely,
Catherine.
Anatoliy. Yes,
So
of course.
just to wrap up and bring together what Teresa, what Gary, and what Donnacha have been saying, what we're seeing right now is that we are paying collectively in our society for the bad policies that we've pursued in the past, both internally in terms of healthcare, education, and integration, and internationally in terms of, allowing Putin and Russia to get away with the occupation and war in Ukraine for the last 8 years. However, to end on a more positive note, similarly, as Donnacha has pointed out, Soviet Union has fallen apart. We in the West, in free democratic countries, we have defeated an empire of evil in the past. So to those people saying there's nothing we can do, Putin has nuclear weapons, what can we do? You're just not thinking creatively enough. We can do this, we can end this, and we can win because we have before and we know that it is possible. So keep faith, get creative, and make sure that we don't let this get, as bad as it possibly can get.
I think those are very good words to end on. thank you very much for them. Solidarity, I see in the chat there, solidarity to the Ukraine, absolutely. You know, we will keep pushing from all corners to respond as we should, with not just solidarity, but practical support and resources. And thank you very much to all of you, Anatoliy, Teresa, Donnacha and Gary, for being here with us tonight. And tomorrow is another day, and we shall see how it goes forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.